get the tech.
Suzanne is asking in the Q&A whether we can see her or hear her, which we cannot.
No.
No.
Let me type the answer and say, no, we cannot.
I think she's got the same problem that I have right now.
Yeah, I'll send a
that's
message
Q&A.
to the tech. 1 second.
You.
Okay. Yeah, same thing from Eric.
Yeah, so before we can deal with biotechnology issues, we've got to figure out the technology issue.
Yeah, this is true.
Should be easier.
Who's the other person? That's
Eric?
having an issue with the sound.
Looks like Eric. Wait a minute.
Oh,
Eric's
is it
not.
Eric? Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
Documents open. There we go. The minute I leave, they're gonna fix it. See what's happening.
I think it's the same thing that happened yesterday where it just needs to be made a panelist.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, actually, I'm going to do it right now. Just give me 1 second.
Oh,
Sorry for the
Thank
delay.
you.
Yes, sir.
wonderful.
There we go. Join as panelists.
All right, here we are. Can
There
you
he
hear me?
is. Hey, Eric.
How are you guys?
And hey, Suzanne.
Hey, thank you.
Well, here.
You want to ask that question or comment you want to make to Celeste? We all want to hear it.
Yeah, what was your question, Suzanne?
Uh-oh.
You can't hear
No,
me.
there are communication issues.
Ask her.
Sorry, were you talking to me?
Yes.
Can hear you.
Yeah.
I missed
Yeah.
the question. I'm sorry.
What was the question you wanted to ask Celeste in the last session or the comment?
Oh, crap. What was the question? Oh, I was wondering. So NIH has this Bridges to the Doctorate program that they've been running for many, many years. And
I know.
yeah, and I was part of a group that reviewed it back in the spring. And it's actually done quite well. The percentage of students who transition from the 2-year to the 4-year is very high. The percentage who finish once they get to the 4-year is also very high. It's less clear how many of them actually stay in STEM or go into STEM related careers, but not so much because the data aren't showing that, but because they're not collecting the data faithfully. But, you know, considering the number of underrepresented folk who starting community college and then eventually find their way into 4-year degrees, I just thought that was something that might be worth thinking about from an ATE/NSF point of view.
Yeah, I wonder if they know about that. That came out of, that was an extension of the Lewis Stokes Alliance for Minority Participation.
So Suzanne, I'm not remembering, is the Bridges to Doctorate program, that's not for post-grad?
Sorry, Bridges to the Baccalaureate.
Aha.
There's
got
a
it. So
Bridges to the Baccalaureate and there's a
baccalaureate.
Bridges to the Doctorate. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I was thinking about the very many students who I talk with who are not quite ready, they believe, to go into graduate school. And they really cherish these experiences of a year or two working with a research group. And I just feel like there's never enough funding for that. But that's
Yeah.
Thanks.
Point. Eric, you got your hand up.
Yep. So the question I had, and maybe this is germane to the discussion we should be having here, is to what extent large universities are on board, and what is being done in order to change the way it is business as usual? I mean, having been in 2 or 3 different large universities, I know perfectly well that changing anything has a huge inertia, and it doesn't seem that we have the time to wait until curriculum gets changed and everybody agrees that this is a good idea, and creating shorter programs and so on. So are we kind of losing everybody that is going to land grants and so on?
Yeah, another good question, and I wish Les was still around. We could ask her. I get the sense from the presentation that they're working with students at all levels, all different kinds of institutions. And, you know, she's mentioned 2-year colleges, 4-year colleges, minority serving institutions. So AID as a program has a pretty broad reach now. Whether they're involving the really big land grant schools, I don't know.
Yeah, well, maybe Suzanne can provide us a perspective of how it might be at Duke, because I think that establishing a new program, I mean, you have to go through so many levels of approval that you're talking probably about a couple of years before it can even be started to be implemented.
Yeah, it's a real pain in the behind, especially at public schools where you not only have to go through approvals on campus, but then often there are additional layers of complexity and annoyance at the state level. You know, one thing one really cool model that comes out of a land grant is at Virginia Tech. When Karen DePaul was there as the dean, she started these things called IGEPs. I think it stands for Interdisciplinary Graduate Education Program. But the long and short of it is, it's an admitting program, but it's not a degree granting program. And so the students come in and they're interdisciplinary. I think they have to be between at least two departments, might even be between 2 schools. But the idea is the students come in, they spend the first year kind of exploring, and then they choose a degree granting program based on the research project they choose and the advisor they choose. What's cool about it, I mean, first of all, it's interdisciplinary. So you get students working across disciplines and getting to know each other across disciplines. But the other thing that's really neat about it is you don't have to go through a bunch of approvals because it's just an admissions portal. So theoretically, you can assemble them when you need them, and you can disassemble them when, a particular area is no longer of interest or no longer of use. I think it's a really neat model, and it's something we've started talking about. We haven't actually acted on it yet, but we're at least thinking about it. We had a conversation with Karen last week.
Yeah, I tried to get IGERT funding a couple of times unsuccessfully, but doesn't the model involve having a particular theme for the I know it's graduate education, but you have to have a particular theme that all of the student study is going to be about. Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that seems like a good model.
I want to comment on Eric's question. And does this involve this worrisome remark about the transfer of students to another school? Is often there's a barrier if their list of courses are not accepted. And I presume there's a bigger barrier the more prestigious is the school. They're going to set the bar at a level that makes it difficult for these students who might want to transfer in to have those credits accepted. So I think that's a big deal. That holds back ambitions, and people who face an additional year to the baccalaureate degree, may make it unaffordable for them to continue on. So what is my point in this? I feel like we can get creative. So if somebody has a course that is deemed to have covered 3/4 of the material, but they want to transfer into a school where 1/4 is missing, and if we just assume that is correct, can we adopt something like a module that lets the student gain the additional knowledge, but still have that course be accepted with the completion of the module? So that took me a while to say that, but basically breaking down those barriers for transfer students, I think, like I said, it's a big deal. My wife, she was at a community college in New Jersey, ended up transferring to Rutgers and graduated on time. She has a PhD in marine biology ultimately. My daughter went to a small school in Massachusetts. She tried transferring to University of Connecticut and got in, but there's all sorts of barriers for her courses being accepted. So what I'm wondering is it actually getting worse through time for students? Is this problem getting worse? So I've said enough, but I'd love anybody's response to this.
Suzanne?
So, so I don't know if this is a complete response, Paul, but I think that's a brilliant point. You know, and to me, it brings up another question, and that's the question of working experience and the degree to which working experience can be counted as an academic credential. You know, I think especially when we're talking about skilled technical workforce, we're talking about adult learners, there's the likelihood that individuals have learned an awful lot about the science by doing rather than by sitting in a classroom. And, you know, one of the barriers to going back to school is not having the opportunity to count that lived experience as an academic credential. I know that's hard, and especially for, you know, places like Duke that tend to not think that anybody can do it as well as they can in a lecture. But I think that's an important conversation for us to have.
Thank you.
So what, does anyone know about this built model that Celeste talked about? That seemed like, it seemed like an adaptable, you know, curriculum design program. So that students in partnership with, you know, the companies that they hope to work for can design their own curriculum. That, if I understood that correctly, that seems like the kind of thing that we should be doing, because the students are working directly with the people that, you know, they hope to be employed by or hope to employ them. And, you know, those people are telling them what kinds of things they should be taking, how the curriculum should be structured. Now, I don't know how that interfaces with the universities that these students are attending, but that seems to me like a good model.
Yeah, if I could comment on that. I don't know that model. I mean, I agree with you. It sounds creative and useful. I'm more familiar with universities deciding that they are going to partner with businesses as part of the education path and having their students experience this. Again, I've always got some kind of family perspective on this, but my brother went to Northeastern University, got an engineering degree, but it was a 5-year model because he was doing internship along the way. I do not recall whether that business ended up employing him straight out, but he's had a good career in computer engineering. And I wonder if that's a rare example at Northeastern. I mean, it's reminding me a bit of what you're saying. Can we build in, I guess that's why it's called build in some of this professional side expertise, I guess, into the education path? Is that what you mean, Hank?
Yeah, that's how I understood it, but this is another case that I really don't know anything about that program. I Googled it, see if I could find it, and I couldn't find it. And I can't remember how she translated that acronym. So maybe I can ping her. But yes, things like that, you know, where there's a lot more built-in flexibility about what's going to be accepted for a student's credit, like you were referring to, Suzanne. You know, life experiences, that kind of thing. I think that's really valuable. And then the classes and the internships that students really need to develop the skills in this space, you know, that should be what we're doing. And
You know, it raises questions though about accessibility, right? Because not everywhere is business plentiful. You know, there are what I would call business deserts in places that are more rural and agricultural like such. And so there is going to be some bias already built into the system just trying to follow a model like that.
yeah.
So
Yeah, that's a terrific point. Not everybody has this in their backyard to capitalize
Right.
on it, nor could they. You know, it's just a University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, which does not have a bunch of that nearby. Chicago does, but who wants to drive 2 hours to Chicago?
And not every
Right.
place has
Experience.
broadband internet, so online is not necessarily the answer.
Right.
True.
You know, if you're in California, you know, outside of Silicon Valley, that's one thing. But being in Iowa or, you know, places like Western Alabama.
So can we think of a model that would work there? I mean, dare I say virtual experiences? I mean, because, you know, this is not the same as me sitting in the room with you. I don't think that that's something we need to be continuing to use. But I don't know, Scott, do you have any further thoughts on how to make up for that?
Ooh, yeah, I mean, it's a tough one, right? Because if how would you do that? You couldn't do it that way. Um, you know, the way I understood how that program worked was that it was industry individuals adjusting the curriculum on the fly, bringing hands-on equipment and experiences to them. And that's a lot of infrastructure to be dealing with. You know, that not only needs to potentially be transported, but also updated as technology changes over time. So that becomes a real bottleneck, I can imagine. It could, if you were in a area that didn't have a dense enough concentration. So, I mean, it would be almost like trying to come up with regional centers or something like that, like hubs where these kinds of activities happen instead of trying to make it dispersed across the country.
Well, the alternative is to think it the other way around, right? And what I'm thinking is how it used to be in the old times. You would have apprentices working directly in place and learning directly on site. So I understand that that demands quite a bit from industry in this case, because in some ways they need to make a commitment to train the employees right in place without necessarily having them come with all the correct credentials. But on the flip side, I think history tells us that that has been very, very effective. So I'm wondering as to whether we shouldn't be rethinking about something like that. The other comment I want to make, and once again, I would love to hear your opinions about that, is that I find that students lack professionalism. What I mean with lacking professionalism, and particularly in the bioscience, is that I don't think they're mature to go into a job in which they have deadlines and so on. And it's a soft skill that I particularly think we are very, very poor at training. Engineers do a much better job.
Eric, I agree completely. When I was at UNC Chapel Hill, we had a conversation with some of our alums who were in industry and in positions to employ students, and most of them were in the sciences, frankly. And that was one of we asked them for a set of skills that our students didn't have when they walked through the door, and time management, people, anything related to people, communications, people management, having difficult conversations, assessing performance, all those sorts of things. They said students have no idea, completely clueless. But again, I think those are competencies, and this idea, you know, I you know, at a place like Duke, it's hard to have conversations about quote unquote competency-driven education. But the long and the short of it is most of our students don't want to be us. They don't want to be faculty. They want to get as far away from academia as they possibly can, as quickly as they possibly can. So this idea of training students and providing them with the skills that are going to allow them to be successful once they transition out of academia, I think it's long overdue, especially at places like this.
I completely agree. The question is whether we are the ones that are best.
Yeah, great question. Great question.
That's a great question.
The great question.
Yeah, this is a good topic. I just hired a lab manager and she had been in industry. She's, I don't know, nearly my age. So she's late 50s. And she came in, she's been great. And immediately she asked me for my team of whatever it is, 15 people. It's like, have these people ever had any management skill training? And I was like, why do you ask that? It's just like, well, they're nice, but they seem to have no clue about working in sort of a business setting.
Mhm.
And I had to admit to her, well, nobody ever taught me that either. and I felt like I just had to learn it on the job. But it was I mean, these are spot on comments. So where the training would come from, I don't really know that, but
Well,
I
but
think
once
we should
again,
be
I
worried
think that
about this.
that's in my opinion, Paul, is where industry has already been doing this.
Mhm.
So this idea of learning on the job itself as an apprentice, I mean, maybe that's the most practical way of investing the money rather than giving them to us at the universities to train them in a way that is not necessarily most efficient for industry, is to give the money to industry to train them.
I think that's a neat idea, Eric. Can I throw out another one? I just came out of a meeting with the provost, and one of the conversations that was going on there was about faculty roles and, making sure that faculty have opportunities to advance and train and yada, yada, yada. And part of the conversation focused on professors of the practice who, are folks who typically come from industry. They come from someplace else. They spend time on campus. They bring all that rich experience to campus, but we typically channel that rich experience into, some sort of more technical aspect. Wouldn't it be neat if we could harness those professors of the practice to provide us with a sense of the culture in industry, and how we can better prepare our students for the culture?
That's right.
Good suggestion as
Well,
well.
Did I understand you said to say, Suzanne, a industry person serving as like a professor of practice on the campus?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, for example, at Carolina, we had it was fortunately endowed, but we had a term professorship that allowed us to bring somebody into the graduate school for 3 years to work with our students. I wasn't doing this sort of thing; I was doing something else. But I would love to have in this graduate school term professorships where I could bring people in from industry, embed them, and then leverage their experience to provide our students with a better sense of what it looks like outside of the ivy-covered walls.
Idea. So I think they do that in engineering, huh? So engineering always attracts lots of industry people back. Law schools do too. They attract lots of lawyers. They come back and they teach, but they also, educate students about the profession. So
We are particularly bad, and I'm talking about biological sciences. In fact, I would argue that if you look at emotional maturity, many of the students that we see are significantly less mature than what you see in many of the more applied careers.
I agree. I mean, I think we're very good at creating independent thinkers often, but not really worried so much about their professionalism. And I just could speak on behalf of my department. We very, very rarely have anybody from the business sector or industry at the podium, so to speak, for a seminar. Were they frequently coming to visit with us, then we could maybe channel some of their energy when, it's not uncommon for these individuals who come and give seminars. I do this all the time. I meet with the trainees, especially graduate students, but I'm not talking with them about this subject. We might have to, I just think that that's kind of part of our culture, is having people come in. And if we focus more on such individuals who can give back in this way, it's like, hey, we really crave this for our students to hear from you on this. That could work.
I agree,
it's a little
Paul.
bit more built in.
I think it goes even broader than that. There's just a fundamental disconnect between academia and industry in the biological sciences that doesn't exist in chemistry, doesn't exist in engineering. I'm the member of ASBMB. I've been a member of ASBMB for many, many years. And, we're talking about our membership and how we sustain our membership and how we, encourage young people to not only join the society, but stay in the society. And one of the challenges we're facing is, again, our students don't want to be faculty. So they look at ASBMB and they say, there's a bunch of faculty members. Why in the world would I spend time with them? And we haven't been able to attract enough folks from industry to our society to make it worthwhile for young people to say, yeah, okay, there are some people in industry. It's worthwhile for me to be part of ASBMB. And I don't think we're alone. I've talked to people with ASCB who say the same thing, ASM, they say the same thing. So, why is there such a barrier between industry and academia in biological sciences? I don't get it.
well, that's definitely something that we're gonna have to fix to address biotechnology. So do you think we've addressed both the questions, um, opportunities for building the workforce, what gaps should be filled, what bottlenecks must be overcome? Is there anything else there?
Nobody
Can
would
I
like to
throw-
hear
I'm
this.
sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
I mean, I wanted to throw one other thing out at the other end of the pipeline, and that's the postdoc end. You know, comment was made yesterday about the dearth of domestic postdocs, which is true, and I think a big concern. And I personally think that goes back to this idea that postdocs also don't want to be us. The few who do want to be us, I think, are, I think they're well served by the structure we have now, reasonably well served. But I think there's an opportunity to make the postdoc structure within academia look a little bit more like the junior scientist structure in the corporate world. You know, people go into the corporate world not to get more training, but because they want a job. And they want a job that ultimately has some sort of potential for advancement associated with it, maybe has some benefits that allow them to buy a house and, live a decent life, start saving for retirement, start, taking care of their children. We don't have that sort of structure in academia because we treat this as, almost an apprenticeship, as a, pay your dues for a few more years before you can aspire to be the great professor. Well, that's not what people want to do anymore. So I think there's a need to rethink the way we structure the training, quote unquote, on the far end of the pipeline too. And if we do that, I think we may have a chance of attracting more domestic postdocs.
Yeah, it's a tough one when it comes to cultural change, though.
That's right. It does require
no
cultural
question.
change.
No question.
Yeah.
Well,
Eric, were you going to make a suggestion?
I was just going to say that without cultural change, this is not going to work. We're just patching. The cultural change needs to come. There is no alternative. And if it doesn't come, it's just, what are we doing, right?
I'm curious whether any of you can speak on behalf of your institutions about whether you have an Office of Postdoctoral Affairs that's trying to fill the gap. I think ours exists and it has some leadership that keeps turning over. And I think they're well-intentioned in this space, but I wouldn't say they're making terrific strides. I'm not sure if it's if the postdocs aren't willing to participate in what's being offered, if they're not really being given a menu of items of things that do help them, they perceive, get jobs. And that's a hard thing for a federal agency to come in and say, do this, because that's very institution specific. But can anybody speak to any exemplary efforts of your postdoctoral affairs program?
Wish I could.
I think a lot of institutions have these postdoctoral affairs departments or offices within provost offices, stuff like that, academic affairs. But I don't feel like they're doing an effective job. And the dearth of postdocs is proof that it's not being effective. And I don't. So it seems to me like those offices are there for research compliance, right? Are we treating our postdocs the right way? Otherwise, we're not going to get the funding to support them. And but yeah, I don't really see any evidence that we're doing an effective job in how we handle postdocs in terms of their own development. It's all about us and what we need, not about them.
And to be honest, I don't think these offices are charged with doing that. I mean, ours sits in the Office of Research, and it's basically just there to make sure there's somebody looking after postdocs, or at least pretending to do it. But they're not charged with doing anything creative. They're just steering the ship and keeping it away from the iceberg.
In our case, I don't think they're even doing that. I mean, I think it's something that the university has there to check a box. Needs to have somebody. It's completely. I've had him come and speak to the one who's chair of the department, come and present to the postdocs in the department. They never follow up. So, and the opportunities are there. I mean, in a place like Michigan State, there are tons of opportunities for doing training and building this a number of different levels. It's just, I don't know if it is funding, wrong administration, whatever.
So if we were going to change that model of, postdoc mentoring so that our postdocs, and let's just assume, I guess I'm directing this at Paul and Eric, I'm painting you guys in the biotechnology space. What would you do with a grant-funded postdoc to, engage that person with industry that's most closely aligned with the work that you're doing, the research that you're doing, so that, that postdoc's experience is not solely in the academic domain. It is, academia and industry and something that's relevant both to your research and hopefully the kind of things that they want to do.
You want to go first, Eric?
Well, I think the model of internships is the way it should go, right? It does force us academicians to give a little bit away because we do know that we're not going to be getting from industry the same level of transparency as we normally offer. And that could be an issue, but if we're thinking about the training opportunity for a postdoc, and I'm doing that with some of my PhD students right now, just letting them go into industry, working on something that's related to my research, but it's more towards the interest of the industry. I'm not hoping to get anything back from them, outside from the fact that my students do want to go into industry.
Yeah, I feel like for my graduate students, I completely agree. It's a little bit easier of a model for me to have them broaden their educational experience if they were possibly placed through an internship at a company. But I have a weird, I don't know, conflict of interest or whatever it is because I have a company. It's just too small to absorb, even my own postdocs. I've always encouraged them, reach out to the company, let's collaborate. But I think I'm too much of a softie. I don't make it happen. And they're not running to do it. Plus, it's not in their backyard is the problem. I'm in New Haven and the company's in San Francisco. So it's a little bit unrealistic to have them go across the country for this experience. But I mean, it's a great question, Hank. This is a tough one. How do we enact this kind of change? And the postdocs are clamoring for this. And I feel like we're not bringing it. We're not figuring out creative ways.
Yeah, I'm not talking about being unselfish, and just letting your postdocs or grad students go and work for somebody else. I think the main way to make this work is that it does pay dividends to the investigators. That, that something better. Think about it like a sabbatical. You go on a sabbatical and you go and work in someone else's lab and you learn something new. Well, isn't this a great opportunity to give postdocs that experience and to bring that back to your lab or graduate students, which is probably what you're doing now.
Totally agree. So if I had the money, you're right. If I had a grant, I had the money, I would not only expand the workforce at my company, but the postdocs would benefit from this because they would be in a different kind of a professional setting and they would learn through apprenticing. So I hear you. So that was your original question. I missed that. So yeah, if I had the money as a co-owner of a business, that's what I would do, is place the people at my company because that is the selfish reward that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Can I play devil's advocate on something you just said? Because it sounds like the postdocs aren't taking advantage of the opportunities even when they're there. And I think that goes back to something earlier in our conversation about how immature these folks are. There's a conversation going on in graduate education right now that the long and short of it says that the typical incoming PhD student looks more like a first-year undergraduate did 5 or 6 years ago, because they're not mature, they're not proactive, they're not taking responsibility for their own education, for their own learnings. And I'll be honest, by the time you're a postdoc, if you can't take responsibility for yourself, then when in the world are you going to take responsibility? So I would say that if we build it, they will come model, it's up to them to recognize, to first of all identify what they need and then go after it. And yeah, we need to have the resources in place to let them do that, and we have to have the flexibility to let them do that. But I don't think we have to drag the horse to water. I think that's actually not serving them well.
Yep. I was
Offer
going to say the same
postdocs.
thing. I
So,
think by the time they're postdocs, if we have to discuss these issues, it's too late.
Mhm.
So I would invest in undergrads and perhaps in PhD students. I would not, I don't think it is the best investment to think about the postdocs, at least not with the model of postdocs that we have today.
So are you thinking professional development of a sort for undergrads, graduate students, getting people better prepared for this maturity and these skills that are going to be valuable?
Yeah.
Kind of in principle, no matter what they do next, whether it's
That's right.
academia or
Right.
that's what you're thinking.
That's true. With the caveat that time is finite, which means that you can't really do it all, right?
Yeah, so sorry, I don't want to dominate. So the thing that is interesting to me is that we have the required ethics training, right? Everybody has to have ethics training now in order to be eligible for federal funds. So if we had, that just seems to make sense from a ethical standpoint, but insisting that everybody gets some professional development training for their own good is probably hard for a federal agency to come down on university and say, you must do this. You know, what's the incentive for them to do that? I wish they would, because in a sense, the system would then change and it would help solve in some way this matter, but I just don't see the logic steps that make this possible. I don't know if anybody else does.
so the diversity programs that I worked with, it was very deliberate. You had to give the students professional development skills. And I would think about that. I was like, wow, why aren't we giving this to everyone, all the students we work with? It was an element, it was a part of the diversity programs that you had to give the students that kind of training. But it isn't, in the way that we interact with students, except I guess in the case, we take students to meetings and stuff like that, and they get to interact with other scientists at the meetings, they give posters, they do research presentations, things like that. But there was never anything deliberate about the way we did development of our own students, except in diversity programs like LS-AMP and some of the other programs at the graduate level. So
That's a good
I don't
point.
know.
So I feel like our longstanding at Yale University, we have this STARS program for women and underrepresented minorities in science. And I feel like from the very beginning, they've focused on get these individuals the skills that actually help them in the workplace in this way. And at least from my experience, the few times I've gone to SACNAS and Abercams, the whole kind of vibe is professional at that
Right.
conference. And I love my undergrads just as much who go to the evolution meeting. That's not what they're getting at the evolution meeting.
No.
That's not some expectation that they're going to bring a
No, you're
professional
right.
demeanor.
And maybe that goes back in part to the conversation we had yesterday about how students are funded as well, right? So your students in the diversity programs very often are funded by somebody other than the PI. And so if I'm the PI, it's not quote unquote costing me anything to let my student go off and do something else. Whereas if I'm paying for the student on my grants, I may think a little bit differently about that.
Yeah, which comes back to funding and what is the best way to invest the funds that NSF is putting, right?
Yeah.
Okay. How are we doing on time?
Yeah.
We're at 11:20.
So can I ask a follow-up question? So if we believe that engineering and some other scientific disciplines like chemistry kind of expect a more mature student upon graduation, and we in the biological sciences don't see this, Why is it? Is it because of the expectation that upon graduation, there's a higher probability of going directly to the workforce? Why do you think that this difference exists?
I mean, I think that could be it. It may be that they start with different raw material than we do as well. It could be that they model the behavior in ways that we don't. Yeah, you know, for example, most other disciplines have a direct admit, so students got to make a decision from the beginning. I want to join so-and-so's research group. They know they're competing for a spot in that group, and so they got to put their best foot forward, and that best foot probably has something to do with the level of maturity they demonstrate. In the biological sciences, particularly the biomedical sciences, the model is very often I get to rotate that first year. I get to, you know, sample the supply, so to speak, and then eventually I decide where I want to go, based on perhaps not the same sorts of things I would have taken into consideration were I making a direct admit decision. I don't know, maybe that's a downside of the flexibility we allow for students in the biological sciences.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think it's also historical. The way the job opportunities for people in the biology side were significantly less industry driven than they were for chemistry engineers and so on. Our typical curricula don't necessarily include that as part of the component that's needed.
Yeah, this path, the expectation of many students that biology degree go on to med school, and that's great if one wants to take that path. But I don't know, in my experience, the ones that don't do that, we're sort of grooming them to be rugged individualists. And, you know, because that is somewhat valuable in academia, is that you run your own show. It's kind of like running, you know, your own business. If it works, it works. If not, it's kind of on you. So I do want my students to be fiercely independent, but I wonder if there's something about fierce independence that comes with I'm just going to do it my way, and I don't care about the system and how they're going to define my maturity or whatever my traits are, because maybe as much as I can, I'm going to cut against that grain. So I know we're being taped here. I'm being broadly general in what I'm saying, but I don't know. I definitely have seen. Look, I'm in ecology and evolution, and it has a very different vibe to it often in our department than in our molecular department, where those students are often on the path for medical school or something a little more immediate afterwards. That is a typical path, whereas in the EEB, I'm trying to make them creative and independent thinkers, and they go on and they do their own thing. And I just wonder if that's somehow caught up in what this difference is.
And I wonder if it has to do with access to funding in general. You know, when I was, so I'm a biomedical person. I went to grad school at a medical school. I did my postdoc at a medical school. I was faculty at a medical school, dot. And when I went to school many years ago, I remember walking into my advisor's lab, and he said, here's our grant, read the grant, and just come up with something that's related to the grant. And we'll talk about it a bit, but as long as you do something that's related to the grant, it's all going to be fine. By the time I left my lab, and wasn't just me, it was my colleagues as well, we were basically handing students specific aim to and saying, this is your project, go ahead and do your project. It was very empowering for me to have the opportunity to think and do some reading and do some talking to people and then come up with my own project. I think it made me a very different kind of student, and that probably trickled up into what I became in terms of being a postdoc and a PI. I don't know that students have, in the biomedical sciences, I don't know that they have that same level of freedom now, because, you know, when 1 in 10 NIH grants gets funded, you got to hand the student specific aim too.
Good point.
Well, why then, if we're training these students to be independent thinkers like us, why do they not want to be us? What are we doing wrong?
Yeah, we don't have time for me to break this down in the many ways that I think about it. One is they're worried about salary, where they have to be careful in the USA. The numbers, the people who are employed in the positions like us, many of them are in places where they don't get paid well. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be that student who's thinking into academia that they won't get paid well. So that's like just the mean salary gets skewed. It gets pushed over towards the large bolus of people who are not getting paid that well. Work-life balance is talked about a lot in academia. And I just feel like I talk with all my trainees about that. It's like, that is up to you. Look, you got to get prepared. If you go into academia, you are technically in a job where your duties never end. By definition, yes, you could always be writing a grant or a paper or, whatever, but you just gotta put the stop on it for your own mental health. And I just sort of tell them from day one, my philosophy is the work-life balance is what you create, and don't let the system create that for you, because you have some agency and authority in defining it as you want. And they sometimes think, oh, I'm not going to be as successful and so on. Like, again, we're being recorded. I try my best not to work on the weekends if I can get away with it. I'm just super efficient during the work week. And I was like, I'm fine with my job. And I'm trying to give them this confidence that they can do it too.
I agree with you, Paul. I think my sense was that a lot of, what students were reacting to was seeing us, how hard we work, how, when they want to talk to us, we say, not now. And, we forget about the fact that they want to talk to us. And, but yeah, maybe that's what we should do. We should have conversations with them about work-life balance, like how important it is that they, figure out a way. As a professor who wasn't tenured at Tulane, I was raising 2 kids and played a big role in their, development and everything. And it meant, to have to kind of burn the midnight hours so that I could make up for that time I was spending with my kids. But, you figure out a way to do it. And if they're trained as really good independent thinkers and they can get grants when they get out and they can write good papers, it won't be long before the profession becomes really comfortable and the salary becomes, good. And I still think it's a good profession, but how we convince students of that, I don't know.
You're going to say something, Suzanne?
Yeah, I think it's more than that. I think we have a culture in, I guess particularly in the biosciences, that I think we're elitist. I think we're not inclusive on a variety of levels. I think we make it really hard to join the club, so to speak. And I don't think students in this Gen Z millennial generation want to work hard to join the club. They see it as it's an activation energy barrier that they just don't want to tackle. And why should they if they can go to industry and make more money? I don't think we make this an attractive space for students.
I agree. And my quick addition to that, I completely agree with that, is so the rise of biotechnology, I'm seeing it a lot in my own space. I work on phages and other microbes and their uses, and it's very attractive, and the salaries are good. However, it's also highly volatile, and there is very little job security. So I feel like, if anything, the arrow of time needs to catch up with this perspective where people will understand, okay, that is maybe a good alternative to academia, but maybe it's not quite as rosy as you think, because not enough time has amassed for their kind of peers to experience this. And for some of the, there's downsides to working in industry. There are. I mean, it's not a perfect alternative. I think everything has its pros and cons, any job. So I just wonder a little bit if they haven't seen enough of that yet. And it gets back to what we said earlier. If I could have my students go experience industry and see it a bit in real time, there's like very long days sometimes, disruption in, so this is very granular, but microbiology work where you necessarily take the weekend off is like pretty inefficient to me. You have to keep the microbes growing. And it's just, I see this all the time in industry. It's like they're not doing anything on the weekend. I'm like, well, you kind of lose an opportunity. If you could shift your work time so that you would go in 20 minutes on Saturday and start a culture up, then, you might be better off. But I'm rambling a bit.
And then
Sorry.
there's the downsize thing. I mean, my brother is in industry. He didn't do a postdoc. He went directly into industry, has been in industry for 30 plus years. He's almost 60 years old. And every 6 months or so, there's a threat of a downsize. I mean, 300 people just got axed from his company. He is still there, but tomorrow could bring something different. He's 60 years old.
Yeah.
As long as we have tenure in academia, that's a real privilege. And we may not be playing that up enough.
Okay, guys, we got to rejoin the big group. I think we're past due.
Well, thank you. This was a great discussion.
It was great.
You on the other side.